All continents and countries with access to the sea have always had naval fortresses. Being both a country and a continent, Australia is no exception.
Here at Fort Lytton National Park, I'm passing through the entry into the fortifications themselves. The fortifications are a pentagonal-shaped series of earthworks which were built in the 1880s, primarily to protect the new port of Brisbane, the new city.
Australia is obviously an isolated continent, and it was part of the British Empire, so it always felt, I guess, there was a British squadron was in Sydney, the Royal Navy, but that wasn't much protection for the entire continent.
In 1878, relations between Russia and England sharply deteriorated because England supported Turkey in the Russo-Turkish War. As a result, Australia began to fear that the Russian fleet would show up at its coast. The key threat was not that the potential adversary would capture Australian territories, but that it may conduct raids on the country's major ports, Maryborough, Rockhampton and Brisbane.
This is what people feared here. They feared a raid, not an invasion. So each of the little colonies that were scattered along the coast felt that need for protection, to be able to defend themselves if the British couldn't get here to help them.
To build a system of coastal defences, the colonial administration invited British Royal Engineers. Fort Lytton was designed by Lieutenant Colonel Peter Scratchley. Its construction began in 1880 and continued for 2 years.
It's a rare fort in that this is inside the river and all the other forts around Australia are right on the edge of the coast. So this one actually has a moat around it, which is quite different to the other places.
Fort Lytton was constructed at the mouth of the Brisbane River, about 12.4 miles from the port of Brisbane. The fort was to protect the city from enemy ships if they attempted to break through to Brisbane along the river. The fort covers an area of about 750 square metres and is surrounded by a moat. Initially, Fort Lytton had 4 gun positions with 64-pounder muzzle loaders. By the early 1890s, the first 2 positions were equipped with new 152mm breech-loading guns, and the muzzle loaders were placed on the newly built positions 5 and 6. The fort's artillery could engage enemy ships at a range of 7 kilometres, protecting the mouth of the river and the underwater minefield. The mines were detonated via electric cables laid along the bottom of the river. A timber bridge across the moat led to the fort's entrance, protected by gates that were reinforced with iron sheets. Inside the fortress, there were casemates for gun pits 1 and 2 and a gunpowder magazine. The magazine and gun positions were connected by a corridor with brick passages. Various prickly plants were growing around the battery, providing additional concealment and serving as an obstacle.
It was operational by about 1882 with muzzle-loading guns in all the positions and a minefield out in the river.
These two guns are the original 64-pounder muzzle loaders for the fort. They're the original heavy guns positioned in gun pits 3 and 4. They were replaced by more modern breech loaders, and they were relocated here both for training purposes and also to help protect the minefield, which was directly in front of us here in the Brisbane River.
Training was provided to local volunteer units, which were called up and prepared for service by Lieutenant Colonel Scratchley. They formed the core of the garrison. Drills were constantly held in the fort. Gun crews were prepared for warfare.
Number 6 gun, loaded, run up. Number 6 gun on target, prepare to fire. Number 6 gun, fire!
An advanced solution for the time was a minefield, remotely activated with electricity, which was installed in Fort Lytton shortly after the first incandescent lamp was invented.
So the minefields here during the 19th century were connected up to the fort on electrical connections, and they could be exploded by electricity, but they were ones that were actually submerged to the bottom of the river, and they were held down with big chains and weights on the bottom in a certain pattern, so vessels could actually sail over the top. It was just a case of just watching. Well, that was the idea. You watched, you waited. Someone was sitting up that tunnel, and if a ship was trying to get through, they'd wait until it was over the top of the minefield and then explode the mine.
We're in Gun Pit 1 of Fort Lytton National Park. In Gun Pit 1 was sited the major artillery piece, which was the 6-inch disappearing Armstrong guns. The guns got their name because they were loaded under cover in this lower position, and then they were raised on a hydro-pneumatic cylinder ram which lifted the 6-ton barrel above the parapet for firing. If there was a lack of pressure in the ram itself, then these mechanisms could be pushed backwards and forwards to help prime and pump up the air pressure to assist in the raising of the barrel. Once the firing happened, then the recoil and the energy generated from the recoil would swing these big arms back down and then use that energy to pump back up the cylinder again and be ready for its next loading and firing.
The magazines were near the gun positions. Strict safety measures were taken here. There was always the risk of an explosion when storing gunpowder charges and preparing rounds.
This is the black powder rooms of the fort. This is one of the earliest parts of the construction of the fortifications. This is where the gunpowder was stored originally, and the shells and other projectiles were made up before they were passed through the loading galleries to the guns in gun pits 1 and 2. Being black powder, there was very strict provisions to ensure that there wasn't any explosions. So people entering this room had to wear felt boots and overcoats to minimise sparks. The lanterns were held in these recesses, which were opened. The lanterns were then lit. Behind is a solid window, which meant that there was no chance of a spark going through or a draft, and then they were closed again. And that allowed the illumination into where the black powder barrels were stored in the rooms behind us.
World War I battles were fought far away from Fort Lytton. In those years, its key mission was to contain German merchant ships that happened to be in the harbour and to be ready to open fire if an enemy attempted to enter the mouth of the river. But by the early 1940s, Fort Lytton regained its importance in the Pacific region.
Maybe 1 million Americans went through during the Second World War through here. All the American submarine fleet for the Pacific came out of here and at Fremantle. Australian submarines, British, all the airfields that were being set up along the Queensland coast and all the way up towards New Guinea, all the supplies and everything came through here into Brisbane. So it was a major garrison during that time.
Facing a new enemy and new warfare tactics, Fort Lytton had to upgrade its armaments. New guns were installed there.
This is a reproduction of a quick-firing twin 6-pounder gun which was installed here during the Second World War. By that time, the tide of the war had changed a little, and Australians were less concerned about invasion and more about raids from either Japanese submarines or kamikaze-style fast-moving motor torpedo boat. This gun was not only very accurate, but it was also highly effective because it could fire up to 80 rounds per minute. This is Gun Pit 4 of Fort Lytton National Park. And Gun Pit 4 originally was the 64-pounder muzzle-loading guns, and then it was replaced by the Hotchkiss guns in the early 1890s. When the Second World War broke out in the war against Japan in 1941, they rearmed this site by putting in this 4.7-inch ex-naval gun, which was a gun that originally came from one of the warships, the Australian warships in the First World War.
The fort, while it was small, was the only way you could get up the river. You know, you had to come past it, so I guess they thought that if push came to shove, that this is where they would stand, and this may be where they would fall as well, but they would, do their duty. So I guess it provided a lot of a morale boost for the local population.
However, Fort Lytton came out of World War II untouched too. In 1946, it was decommissioned as a coastal fortification. The military stayed here until 1950. Then the land was sold to an oil refining company. Everything changed in the early 1990s.
Fort Lytton was declared as a national park for its historical and cultural values to the Australian people in 1989. It's a very significant site for Australians. It not only is part of our military history, but it's a place of remembrance for the thousands of men and women who trained here before going off to major campaigns such as the Boer War, the First World War and the Second World War.